prohibitions against deficit spending. And so what the federal government ought to do, federal government can borrow on deficits. What the federal government ought to do is to borrow from the private sector, sell treasury bonds to those people who have plenty of savings because they're afraid to spend, right? And firms and banks as well. Sell them treasury bonds, borrow the money, and then hand it over to the states on a per capita basis. Depending on how many people there are in the state of Florida, you get so much per capita. And do that with every state and say, here, we're sure you guys are in trouble with revenue and therefore need help. Here's the revenue. Maintain your state spending so you don't lay off state employees and you keep the state economy bubbling. Instead, what we're doing, thanks to Susan Collins and the others who thought that deficit spending was a bad idea, is that now California is practically like Greece, right? It's trying to figure out how to, because its revenues are down, how to cut expenditures into billions of dollars, literally, in the midst of a recession. New York State is not much better off, and you know the situation here in Florida. We're laying off school teachers. That is crazy, crazy to do. Not only for the long term and what it means for our kids' ability to thrive in a competitive world economy as they go forward, but it's crazy in the short run as well, because what the state ought to be doing is spending to make up for the lack of private spending, to get the economy going again, get people back on their feet until they start spending on their own and the economy takes off, right? So I blame Susan Collins and the Republicans and all those folks who think that deficits are always bad. That's not right. Deficits are sometimes good, and in a recession they're in many cases the only hope. If monetary policy has already got a zero interest rate, that can't go any further. What you have to depend on is fiscal policy by the government. Tax cuts will help a little, but not nearly as much as spending. And if the federal government could borrow and give that money to the states and say, keep your school teachers employed, maintain your highways, make sure you're not laying off firemen and cops, etc., then that's the kind of spending that everybody understands is valuable, but at the same time leads to more spending as those folks go out and spend their earnings to buy consumer goods and so on. So those are the two most important things, I think, that minimize unemployment. Fiscal and monetary policy. Monetary policy has gone as far as it can. Fiscal policy could go a lot further, if only to give grants to the states, it seems to me. And yet we're in a situation now where lots of folks, especially the Tea Party folks and the Republicans, are worried about deficits and debt. This is not the time to be worried about deficits and debt. This is the time to use deficits and the associated debt to get the economy growing again, so that we restore prosperity, and then, once we're prosperous again, the deficits and the debts will shrink. The IMF just came out with a study at the end of last month, which looked at all of the industrialized countries, not just the United States. And they said that deficits had increased and debt by 35% during this recession. And they tried to break it down into where those increases in deficits came from. We're up to 9% of GDP. Where was the source of that? It wasn't stimulus spending. That's a minor proportion of it. I think it was only 3% out of the 35% was the additional spending by the government as part of stimulus packages. 10% of that 35% came from the decline in tax revenues because the economy was plunging. And when incomes go down as the economy plunges, then naturally income taxes go down as well. For the state of Florida, we're in trouble because property taxes, collections have gone down as property values have plummeted. That we're not taking in the stamps that the state and the local governments get when people buy new houses and pay those extra fees that were irritated so much when we buy a house, but they tend to have kept the state revenues and local revenues up. So it's not because we don't have huge deficits because of the stimulus spending. We have huge deficits because the recession is lowering the tax revenue of the governments. How do we get out of a situation where our deficits are huge and adding to our debt? Get the economy going, get it prosperous again. How do you do that? If the private sector is unwilling and afraid to spend, then the government has to step in and spend. And then the only question is, are we going to waste the money on projects that have no payoff for us in the long run? Or are we going to invest in those things that will make us a stronger economy and society in the long run? Things like health, things like education, things like infrastructure. We'll have no problem figuring out what to spend on. What we've got to do is get over the hurdle that the right wing is saying deficits are going to kill us. It's just not true. Deficits are a problem in Greece. Greece has a debt to GDP ratio of something like 120 or 130%. We're about half that. But we had a debt to GDP ratio of 120% at the end of World War II. And you know how we brought down that debt? We didn't pay it off. We're still rolling it over. But the size of the economy had grew so fast in the 50s and 60s, et cetera, that debt as a proportion of GDP, right, the numerator didn't decline, the denominator grew so fast that that ratio fell. That's what we need to do now. Not worry about deficits until we're out of this recession. And that then will put people to work as the economy grows. Right? So if you, we haven't got to the discussion part yet, we've broken up into groups, but my solution is I'm going to use one of my 3 votes on federal government borrowing to give aid to the states to maintain spending and employment at local and state levels, which is, I think, the most important thing and the most efficient thing we can do right now to keep up the level of spending and generate prosperity. Once we're prosperous again, then we can begin to think about, all right, now what's our debt to GDP ratio? How do we bring down the deficits, et cetera? But to do that at a time like this means that we're going to try to get out of deficits and debt through austerity, hunkering down, laying people off, all right, having low levels of GDP, rather than spending to get out of the situation where we need deficits. Deficits are a cause of the recession, right? Our deficits are an effect of the recession, not a cause. And they're also a solution to the recession. Once we get out of the recession, then we can apply our intelligence to figuring out how to bring down the spending, raise the taxes that we need to, once we're prosperous. Okay? So, well, I talked more, and I promised you I would take questions, and I forgot all about that.
Well, no questions now.
No, you don't want questions?
No, we get questions after the